Hello, students. It is Mrs. Moore coming to talk to my literature students. And as you know, we have been studying the last couple of weeks the poetry of Ms. Emily Dickinson. And a couple of weeks ago, you went through and looked at her poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And you looked up unfamiliar words, you rewrote the poems in your own words, you made up some of your own study questions, which, by the way, were very good, and I'm in fact going to give some of them to you as homework this week because I don't have all the answers for this poem. But when you all think a little bit differently, you can lead us towards some different conclusions too, and that's helpful. And it's hard to talk about a poem, just me. I wish we were in the classroom, so it's not going to be as great and fulfilling, but I'm going to do my best and talk about the study questions I gave you guys here now for homework. So I'm just going to look at these questions, talk about them. Again, you're not here to chime in, unfortunately, but I will do my very best, and it will be useful to you because I'm sure to think of some things you haven't thought of, and it can help you and develop your understanding of poetry. And so you do need to watch this because there will be a Google quiz because I have to hold you accountable for your work. Okay, so because I could not stop for death, the poem begins. What do you think it means to stop for death? Well, very literally, it may mean to die, right? To die. And one literal way of looking at this is without death coming for us, how can we stop for death? That's not in our power, perhaps, right? Reasons we can't stop for death. We get busy. Look how busy life is. She says she puts away her labor and her leisure. So those are two things that keep us from being able to stop. We're working, and when we're not working, maybe we're actively resting. So that's good too. So this is kind of how I would consider this first part. We're often too busy to slow down in life, not to mention that power to stop for death isn't really ours, perhaps. Okay? So it then goes on to say in question 2, he kindly stopped for me. Now, Dickinson has turned death into a person. And I don't know about you, but when I think of death, I think of very often the ghost of Christmas Future in A Christmas Carol, some kind of scary cloaked figure, the pointing finger. It's frightening. It seems sort of frightening. But here he's described as being kind. And some of you I know may think of death as being carried away by angels, and that does sound lovely and kind. But here, death isn't a grim reaper figure. He stops kindly. He has come to collect her, right? And I want to mention something as well. Miss Dickinson herself does not mention anything about Christianity in this poem. That is not to say that you can't look at it and have it inform your own faith. But she doesn't mention anything having to do with Christian values. She doesn't mention Christ or the cross or things of that nature. And so we just need to be careful when we're looking at the poem to look at it through her eyes and look at the world she's created here. She has created a world of her own. Again, you can write in ways, though, that you are thinking about faith. That is fine. We just need to be careful to be guided by her as well. Okay? So, what does it mean to have death stopping for you in a kind manner? Well, your number is up, it would appear, and he is not dragging you out of bed in an angry fashion. He's just, think of him as clearly a gentleman. He's described as having civility, gentlemanlike behavior. He's coming to keep a date with you. He's knocking on the door. And so that makes some sense to me, okay? Let's see. Who is in the carriage with death and the narrator? Immortality. Again, this is the quality of living forever. And so, while she may not have a Christian outlook, she has a notion of the afterlife. So somehow death is bringing her and probably going to hand off the reins to immortality at some point. Because death seems maybe to only last a very short time, but immortality is forever, right? It's a way to think about it. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, we are told. So haste is hurrying. You may have heard the expression when you were a child, haste makes waste. If you're in a rush, you perhaps make a mess, or in fact make more trouble for yourself, and things take longer because you've rushed and knocked something over or spilled this, done your work poorly, and you have to go back and do it again because you were in a hurry. So death doesn't need to rush. He wants to do the job right. There's no need to rush, okay? It seems that they're also moving slowly enough in this carriage they can look at things as they go by. That's my dog, excuse him. It is significant maybe that they're taking their time, the question asks. Maybe this just shows us that this is not a hurried operation. And we don't get the sense that the narrator feels rushed or anxious, okay? Now, I want you to think of something else too. I want you to be sure when you're looking at a poem that you're not confusing the author with the narrator. What I mean is when some of you wrote in your answers and in your questions that you kept referring to her as the narrator, but this may not be about her. People write from different perspectives, we know, okay? So let's not assume that Emily Dickinson is talking about her own life. For one thing, how could she be writing about death stopping for her when she had to be alive to write the poem? See, do you see what I mean? So we just have to be careful to think that she may be writing about a character instead, okay? And I had put away my labor and my leisure too. So what is she giving up? Her work. Her work and her rest too. Okay? Why does it matter? It says she's giving these things up for death's civility. So think about it. Very often, what else is there in life? We work and we also have rest. It's a cycle of working and resting. And she's giving up basically what makes her life for death's civility, it says. He's polite. Perhaps if he had been rude and aggressive, or if she were afraid, she wouldn't be willing to let go. But she has to. Okay? So again, death being civil, he's polite, he's good-mannered, well-mannered. So number 6. In the third stanza, the carriage passes 2 things. Okay? It says, we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So there's a school, children are striving, and many of you chose strove as the word to look up. And striving is this attempt to do your best, to excel. And it says they're striving at recess in the ring. It's interesting, they're not striving over their books through a window. They're playing. And that's maybe significant, that a lot of the memories of life are those moments where we're free, we're playing, we're free, we're not learning necessarily. That's important too. But this is somehow significant because we know she was a child once and probably did these things. She passes the fields of gazing grain. And some of you chose gazing as your word to look at. And you defined it as staring intently. And I really found that to be informative because you imagine nature contemplating her as she goes by too. That is, that's something to think about because she sees the children, but it seems that the grain is watching her. The grain will be there after she's gone, right? I don't know. Something about nature and the earth lasting after we leave, maybe? Maybe that's what that means. And why these scenes could be significant, again, being a child is something we don't forget. It's an important stage of life. And as far as the fields with beauty of nature, She liked eating grain. You know, I think more the beauty of nature. And maybe she lived on a farm, we don't know, but it's significant for her. So stanza 3, again, what's significant to you? If you were in that carriage with death and immortality, what would you like to pass? Now that's personal. I'm excited to read what you write. I know certain things that really matter to me. I'm a girl who grew up in the farmland of Ohio, and I used to love going on these certain long runs by cornfields, and there just was nothing more beautiful to me than these open fields. And I would hope to go through that again. Not in a carriage though. I'd want the knees and the body of a 16-year-old to feel really strong and run hard. I would like that. And there are other places I'd like to see. There's a lake the lake that I mentioned in that story I wrote where I grew up, where my father lived, and there are things I'd like to go by that are important to me. Maybe I'd go by Aristoy and give a shout out to my peeps. Yo peeps, right? Things that are important to us. We passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us. That's confusing. I agree. What do you think it might mean? And again, I don't just write, I don't know. Give it a guess. Could it mean that now they have stopped and the sun keeps moving? Do you see what I mean? Like she's no longer a part of the living now, that she's actually dead? Maybe that's what it could mean. I'm not saying for sure. If you have a different idea, that's okay. But maybe that could be the moment it actually happens and time shifts and it's significant in the poem, right? In the 4th stanza, how is the character feeling physically as they drive? You guys did a really good job on this, I thought. So, the dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. So she has on a very thin gown, a thin scarf, and there's a quivering, chill quality to her. So maybe that could be feeling of kind of leaving your body. This is death now. You're no longer of the solid substantive, you're shadow, because it says dews drew quivering and chill, and her clothing seems to be made of things that aren't of a real substance anymore. In fact, many of you described gossamer like spider webs. Now, don't think of her literally wearing spider webs. That's a bit weird, but it's meant to give this feeling of very thin cloth, okay? You kind of might feel chilly as you read it, and that's good. That's good when poems can make you feel. Now, the house. Again, crazy, who knows, right? We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Now, some of you described cornice as snow, like a snowy overhang, and some of you saw it as like part of a house, the roof, the overhang of a house. I've had students in the past say that this is describing a grave, like a headstone of a grave. And I honestly don't know. Let's go on to the next stanza and see if it helps. Since then, 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Now, what horses? The horses pulling the carriage? So if they're looking toward eternity, we can link eternity toward immortality, right? Because immortality is living for an eternity, okay? So maybe the horse is some kind of symbol of living forever and letting her know she's going to live forever. But that house, I don't know. It could be a grave. Some of you said it felt like an old kind of haunted house. We don't get the sense that she's afraid. Again, it's mysterious. It's pretty mysterious. And again, I've told you I don't have all these answers here. Now, I can handle the next question better. Since then, 'tis centuries yet feel shorter than the day. Okay? So, we get the feeling that she's writing to us from the afterlife. Again, this is a narrator writing. She's writing to us, telling us what happened to her the day death came for her. It's been hundreds of years, but time feels like that. I don't know if you've thought much about time and how time is perceived, but I've heard people explain, usually kind of through poetry, that, and this is kind of a Christian idea too, you know, with the rapture, there'll be a blowing of the trumpet and everyone will be in heaven if that's where you're meant to go, right? And that the time you spent in the earth will feel like nothing. The time you spent buried and dead and decomposing and all of that. And so maybe there's something to that here. Again, I don't know about it being in a Christian context, but the idea that time doesn't feel the same once we're dead. I think that she's trying to give us that impression. So, the tone of the poem. Calm. Wouldn't you say it's calm? She doesn't seem upset or fearful or screaming no or running. So it seems calm, like she's accepted that this is happening to her. Okay. And I think because of the ways she's describing death as being kind, civil, and she's putting away her things, watching what she goes by, there's no clinging to life. So there's a calm acceptance, I would say. So, poetry is a form of expression much like a song. How did this affect your own mood and thoughts about the topic? And here I tell you, if you have no thoughts, I can wait until you get them. Don't write nothing. There's nothing a teacher dislikes more than when you guys won't even try, okay? I find this to be comforting and scary too. Personally, this is my answer. I'm not ready for that knock on the door. I'm not stopping for death. At the same time, I like the idea of getting a chance to be in that carriage ride and seeing things that matter to me. I like thinking it's not frightening, that it's something when it happens you accept it. And again, it's her imagination. This is her imagination of what death is like. So, very good. I would like to talk to you a little bit now in our time that remains about Ms. Dickinson's life. Let's see where I put that. Here it is. So, one thing I've told you is that first you take a poem on its own terms, and then it's good to know about her life, about the poet's life. Because here's why we don't want to sometimes know about the poet's life or the times in which she lived first, because it's so easy to just reduce a poem and take all its meaning away. If we just say, oh, this is just about Emily Dickinson, and yeah, she thought about death a lot, the end. No, don't do that. And you limit yourself a lot if all you think about is the author's experience. However, if we never think about the author's experience, we miss some meaning. So in my advice, and other teachers will do things in different ways, and they are free to do so, but I think it's most helpful to look at a poem first as one human being talking to another. She wanted to tell her fellow humans, or just herself, because sometimes we write for our own good, about death. Okay? She didn't necessarily want to say things about herself or her own life, but we know those things inform what we write too. So let's listen to some details about her life. And then what we'll do, and this will be part of your work for this week, is go back to those two poems and see whether the way we look at the poem has been affected at all. Sound good? Okay. So she's an American woman, lived from 1830 to 1886, which makes her 56 at the time of death. Born in Massachusetts to a prominent family, so a family that was respected, known. She was educated. She went to something called the Amherst Academy for, I think, 7 years as a young girl, and then went to Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, so she studied religion. And in fact, she went shortly after, I think it was 2 years after women were allowed to go to the seminary. It makes her a little bit of a feminist, does it not? Okay, a young woman in this era being educated. Think about this. She was a very young girl during the Civil War, right? Okay. Oh, excuse me. She was She was an adult during the Civil War. So that's what an interesting time to live. She lived a very isolated lifestyle. She was considered eccentric. She wore only white later in life, refused to greet guests, to leave her bedroom as she got to be an older woman. She never married. And even then, she maintained her friendships through writing. She wrote more than she actually saw her friends. Only 10 of 1,800 poems of hers were published in her lifetime. And here's the thing, when they were published, they were edited to look more conventional. Now, you may have noticed with her poetry, she capitalizes things in ways that aren't traditional. They have meaning for her, but they don't follow the rules. She'll capitalize death, carriage, ourselves, immortality, civility, children, gazing grain. She capitalizes in a way that is not conforming to traditional rules, okay? And she uses dashes, okay? Lots of dashes, so she has a different style. So think about that. When her poems were published, they were edited. Now, guys, you know how artists feel about having things changed, right? If I've written a beautiful song and you take out some of the lines, I will be so angry you will not even imagine it. Imagine if someone had come along, saw the Mona Lisa, said, this woman needs a mustache, she needs sunglasses, you know, something ridiculous. Changing something, artists have a very particular vision. So this, we don't know whether this infuriated her, but it could not have pleased her. The subjects of her poetry often was death. She wrote about immortality a lot, and she wrote about these things in her letters too. After her death, her younger sister found a bunch of her poems and shared them, and I think she'd been instructed to burn them, but she shared them, which I'm glad she did. In her life, she had a morbid, one might say a morbid fear of death, an unnatural obsessive obsession with it, one might say. When she was 14, her very close friend and cousin died from typhus, and she became very depressed. So depressed that her family sent her away to the city, to Boston for a while, to try to distract her, get her happy again. And then her parents, I think, died closely within one another when she was in her 40s, and one of her favorite nephews died. And each time it really affected her, you know, to the extent she wouldn't come out of her room, depressed her. As a young woman, when she was away at college, she didn't finish her term. She came home and seemed to prefer home life as well. She was very much a homebody. Religion. She was religious, but not in the way that you might think. She knew a lot about religion. She was a believer. She wrote about it. But here's an example of a verse she wrote. Some keep the Sabbath going to church, I keep it staying at home. It sounds like she was a believer who rejected organized religion. So believed that you could have a personal relationship with God, but not have to go to church. This makes her a nonconformist, a person who doesn't follow the rules. Her poetry shows that, right? Okay. There was another death that really affected her. The school she went to as a girl, called Amherst, there was a principal there who died of a brain hemorrhage at age 25, and that depressed her. After her parents died when she was in her 40s, she truly withdrew from the world and wrote a lot. Some say that if she had been diagnosed by modern medical and psychological sources, doctors and things, she would have been diagnosed as an agoraphobic, which is a person who's unnaturally fearful of her surroundings. You can almost, could you all be quieter, please? Thank you. You could almost think of, schizophrenic isn't quite the right thing, but someone who is fearful of imagined things in one's environment, which may be why she stayed home. She also was prone to epilepsy, which is seizures. She died at age 55 of something called Bright's disease, which is a kidney disorder. There was a chemical in her urine that indicated she had this kidney disorder. 55 is very young to die today, and it was certainly still pretty young to die back then. There's one other detail about her life that I share with you, and you can do with it whatever you wish. It was rumored that she was in love with her sister-in-law. So her very good friend at school, whose name was Susan, ended up marrying her older brother. And she wrote a lot of letters to Susan and cared for Susan a great deal. Susan's marriage to her brother wasn't happy. He, in fact, I think had a mistress. The family wanted the name Susan taken out of a lot of those poems. Now, whether that's a romantic relationship or not, I don't know. People sometimes like to project modernity onto figures in history. At the same time, we already see that she lived a very different lifestyle. She never married. She dressed weird, wrote weird, did things that were unusual, worshipped in a different way. So it's a possibility that maybe the only heartfelt, Mary, please don't. Maybe the only heartfelt romantic relationship she had in her life was with her sister-in-law. I don't know. That may be something that you want to think about when you think about her writing, about her being different. It may be something that to you think, oh, I don't know if there's evidence for that. I'm not going to write about it. Okay? I don't know. Okay? So, always lovely to share poetry with you, even though I'm having to pretend you're here. But I will be talking to you again soon. I hope you all are well, and have a lovely week.